Hello and welcome to the MB Om podcast, where you will learn to master the business of yoga with guests from around the world who have experienced becoming successful yoga teachers, studio owners, and much more. Now, here's your host, Amanda Kingsmith.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the MBM podcast. I'm Amanda and I'll be your host for this and all episodes of the show. Today on the podcast, I am super excited to be joined by Rachel Scott. Rachel is a yoga teacher trainer, a curriculum developer in the yoga world, as well as a yoga business coach. I was super excited to have Rachel on the podcast because she has so much knowledge on the yoga industry in general. She has years of teaching all over the world, and she is really interested in the business side of yoga. So on this episode, we talk about everything from teaching in different places. We talk about teacher trainings. We talk about how to create a great teacher training and so much more. And since Rachel and I recorded this episode of the podcast, I was actually in Vancouver, British Columbia, where she's based. We had the opportunity to get together for a coffee. And let me tell you, she is just as awesome, if not even better in person than she is on this episode. So if you're ever in Vancouver or the Vancouver area, I would definitely recommend hitting up one of her classes. Now, before we dive into this week's episode with Rachel Scott, we've got the Schedulicity hot tip of the week with Mickey. Here it is.
Hello, yoga business badasses. This is Mickey with the Schedulicity hot tip of the week. Human beings are not machines. We can only endure so much before we need a break. Yoga teachers treat both the physical and mental well-being of their clients, and that can sometimes take its own mental and emotional toll. When you need a break, Schedulicity makes it easy to create a block of personal time. Carve out a little bit of time for yourself and rest assured that it will be protected in your schedule. Online clients will not know that you're taking a break. They'll only see the times that you are available, so you can practice self-care and avoid burnout.
And of course, a big thank you to Schedulicity for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. And if you guys have any questions about Schedulicity, you can head on over to schedulicity.com or send them an email at support@schedulicity.com. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you by Fave Yogis. The Fave Yogis app is back with new features for teachers. You guys might remember from a few months ago, I had the CEO of Fave Yogis on the podcast. He told me all about his yoga journey in combining yoga with tech, which I think is so unique and so cool. As well, they sponsored the podcast for a number of months, and I love the partnership that I have with Fave Yogis because they really are an app that's designed for you and for me and for all of us yoga teachers out there. Now they're back with even more features that allow you to create and manage your own private classes. You can make payment and registration a breeze. Do you have regular private clients? Make life easier with AutoPay. Forget about remembering to Venmo, or if you're Canadian, you can't even do that. We've got to use cash, PayPal, or direct e-transfer. Sure, it's not that difficult, but the use of AutoPay to enable repeat payments is so much easier. You can also keep your calendars in sync with classes. Google Calendar integration automatically updates both teacher and student classes when you make changes from your Fave Yogis app. It's still just your yoga. Teachers add classes, students add teachers. Teachers and students stay connected. Head on over to your app store and download Fave Yogis for free. And use code MBOM, and let them know that I sent you. FAVYOGIS. All right, on to today's episode of the podcast with Rachel Scott. Rachel, welcome to the podcast today. I'm super excited to have you here with me.
Oh, hi, Amanda. Thank you. I am so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to chat with you. And I know we're going to cover so much good stuff about yoga, the business of yoga, all of that on this episode. But I want to start with your yoga story. Can you tell me how you first got into yoga?
Oh, sure. So I was living in New York City, and this is a time when I was a struggling actor. And I went on a weekend, kind of artistic retreat. And one of the lead directors there, who's one of our teachers, kind of grabbed me by the shoulders at one point and looked me in the face and was like, "You have to calm down. Like, you have to chill out." So he said, try yoga, try something. He's actually, to be totally candid, what he said was, maybe smoke a joint or do some yoga. And I was like, I think I'll go to yoga. And one of my friends had started doing yoga, and this was back in 1990, 8 or so. So yoga was still kind of, it was in New York City, it was more mainstream, but it was still kind of fringy. And so I went to this studio and I just loved it. I tend to have, like many of us, I tend to have a hyperactive brain. And so having a space to get into my body and to my breath and to be in a different rhythm, it was just amazing. And I loved how my body felt. I loved that the poses were, challenging and interesting. And over time, of course, then we start to develop all of those other things that we love about yoga, like the philosophy and the, meditation qualities and all of that kind of stuff too. But that's what started me off, was someone told me I had to chill out, basically.
That's amazing. I love that. And what kind of inspired you to take your practice from, just a practice to actually wanting to teach it?
I was completely jealous of my friend who had signed up for her teacher training. So it was hilarious. I went away to grad school and came back to the city. And first of all, I was so interested in yoga. And, once we kind of get bitten by the bug, and a lot of your listeners will totally get this. Once you kind of get bitten by the bug, you're like, I just want to jump into the swimming pool. I want to know everything. And so I was, hemming and hawing, because of course we all know teacher training is kind of pricey too. It's kind of expensive. But my girlfriend, one of my friends, was doing her teacher training. And I had this pang of jealousy, like, oh my God, I want to be doing that. And so whenever that happens, it's a sign usually that we need to follow that path. There's something over there for us. So I signed up for the next session. And then I did my 200 hour, and then I immediately back-to-back that with a 300 hour. And then I did another 500 hour, and it was just tons of continuing education and all of the rest. And I was totally in it. So
that's amazing. What was doing your 300 hour like right after your 200 hour like?
You know what? It was all right, because we did, for me, it worked. Like, I understand some people like to take time off and there's no right or wrong way, I think, to do it. But both of them were long form programs. So I was not in intensives. And as we'll probably talk about, my whole passion and expertise really lies in education. So when you're doing something in a longer term format, I think it's a little bit kinder in terms of integrating. It might have been a little too much to do it as an intensive or something like that. But for a 300 hour, I really feel like it's nice when you have more time and space to kind of let everything seep in. So for me, it totally worked. Like I was committed and it totally fed me. And I didn't feel like it was too much information, probably because we had space and time, like 6 months or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's really cool to hear. And so after you finished your 200 hour, did you start teaching right away?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my studio that I worked at, and this is New York, and they're a bit more competitive over there. So my studio, which was Ishta at the time, Alan Finger, who's amazing, but the studio wouldn't even hire you until you were 500 hours certified. So that's the baseline, for in more competitive cities. And so I started teaching like many of us, by donation classes. I taught for free. And then I started off teaching in, a little bit less high profile places like gyms and smaller yoga studios that weren't in Manhattan, like in Queens and stuff like that, where I lived. So like many of us, I started off not really worrying so much about the money, but just trying to get my feet underneath me and, get in and practice and teach. Because that's really the only way you become a better teacher, is to just actually do it. So yeah, I started teaching, and then I was actually doing my 300 hour program while I was teaching these volunteer classes. And then after a while, after I'd graduated from the 500 hour and been practice teaching a while, then I started to teach at my studio, which of course was exciting and thrilling and super scary and cool.
Yeah, it's always scary when you get that like first actual like time slot at a studio. You're like, oh crap, I got to do this thing now.
That's right. You're like, I'm in the driver's seat now, where all of my favorite teachers have stood. It's crazy. Yeah, that was really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really cool. And what were you doing like for work at that point? Like, what was your career, I guess, in a past life?
Oh yeah, you know what? I've always been very eclectic, and I've always done yoga teaching and also complemented that with some other work. like for the past decade, that work has also happened to be in the yoga business and yoga industry and yoga education. But at that point, I was also using yoga. Yoga wasn't my primary career. My career was still being an artist. So I was teaching acting. I was teaching stage combat. I was a tutor. I was an academic tutor. Because I had, like good academic skills from Columbia. And so I was tutoring kids. So I had a few different things on the go. And that's one of the things that's great about being a yoga teacher is that yoga as a career can really fit into your lifestyle. It can become something that's full-time, or it can be something where you're teaching a few classes a week. So at the beginning, it was more like a few classes a week. And I actually, right off the bat, I started working in yoga studio management. So as part of my 300-hour, I was doing work study, and then they were like, can we just hire you to come on and basically be our teacher manager? So then I was assisting in the studio business, which was big. It became Yoga Works in New York City. So it was a really interesting perspective to get there, to have insight into how a big corporate yoga studio worked. So a whole bunch of things at the time. And then I really transitioned to yoga actually after moving to Vancouver, which wasn't until a couple of years later. And then yoga's been pretty much my full-time gig in different aspects for the last decade, I'd say.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Are you Canadian or American?
I'm both. I'm now a
nice.
dual citizen. Yeah, sweet. So I came over to Canada, and here's a, short and tragic tale. So I came to Canada marrying a dual citizen. But our marriage exploded into fiery hell within about a year. So I got divorced, but I stayed in Vancouver and was a permanent resident, and then got my citizenship probably like 4 years ago or 3 years ago, something like that.
Nice. Amazing. I'm sorry to hear about your marriage, obviously, but it sounds like you get to be Canadian now as well as American, which is best of both worlds. I
get to be Canadian. You know what? It actually, and this is a little bit of a tangent from yoga business, but I actually wrote a book about this called Head Over Heels, A Yogi's Guide to Dating, that chronicled my experiences coming out of relationship and how yoga applies to relationships in the real world, and how like so many lessons we learn in these situations like divorces or disappointments and falling in love, falling out of love, like all of that. So much of our yoga shows up in those moments that, as much as it was a challenging experience, I learned so much about myself. And, so I wouldn't, even though it was hard, I wouldn't trade it.
Yeah. No, definitely. That makes sense. I feel like, life throws us curveballs and that sort of thing. But I think the way that we can kind of come out of them and learn from them is definitely the most important aspect of that, which obviously you've turned that into something that you've learned a lot from, which is really amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and yoga helps with that too. So.
Oh, for sure.
Oh, right. Thank goodness.
Yeah. It's like, thank goodness this little square mat exists that I can find some sanity on this, in this crazy life, for sure.
Totally. Yeah.
And so you started teaching yoga full time. You're living in Vancouver at this point. Can you take me from, being a full-time yoga teacher to doing what you do now, which is, helping studios, teachers, running retreats, all that good stuff?
Yeah, sure. So I came to, I actually was only what I'd call a full-time yoga teacher. Like, hey, someone who teaches 25 classes a week. I did that for like 2 months. And other than that, it's always been I'd say anywhere between 6 and 10 classes a week. Because what happened is that I came over, and my passion is education. I love education. I love teacher trainings. I've always been a teacher. When I was an academic teacher, and I was a teacher in the arts and conservatory. And then yoga, it was like, I want to be a yoga teacher. And then it's like, I want to be a yoga teacher trainer, because I just love the process of learning. And so when I came to Vancouver, I started chatting with the studios here, and I had begun to become a teacher trainer with Yoga Works and gone through their process and started doing that with them. And then here in Vancouver, we have a company called Y Yoga, which is kind of like, they'd hate me for saying this, but it's kind of like the Yoga Works of Canada. It's a big corporate yoga studio. And so I saw them when I came here, and I thought, oh my God, I want to work for these people, because this feels like this feels like an opportunity that was like the situation I was in before. And, when you're working I've always been a fan. For me, I like using other aspects of my skill set besides just the yoga teaching. So I really like using, my management skills and my organizational skills and my writing skills and all of that stuff. So I wanted to work for a company where might be able to earn a decent living just in the yoga world. So they and I were in talks for a while, and I came on as a studio director for them, but only for a few months, because shortly after that, the person who was running their teacher training department moved down to the States. So, and I told them, I said, hey, I'm happy to be a studio manager, but what I really want is teacher training. That's my thing. Mm-hmm. And so when that position came up, they turned around to me and they said, do you want this position? We'd like to talk to you about it. And I was so freaked out. I was so scared and so excited, because I knew that I would want to recreate the teacher training program from the ground up, because it hadn't really been created with a methodology in mind. It was kind of like, oh gosh, like we know, like many teacher trainings, it was the love child of a lot of different teachers with a lot of different ideas. And so while it was an interesting training to me, it wasn't educationally necessarily how I wanted the department to be. And so I took the job. I was so excited. And that's when I really flipped to being full into this whole yoga business. So I always taught. It's always been 6 to 10 classes. But then I created their whole teacher training department, 200-hour, 300-hour continuing education programs, and also managed teachers. So I was, auditioning teachers, coaching teachers, hiring teachers, all of that stuff. So it was an amazing job, and I absolutely loved it and did it for 8 years and worked with great people. But during that time, I also went away and I got my master's. I didn't go away. I did it part-time while I was working my job to get my master's in instructional systems and learning technology, which is, basically a way I was creating all these programs, but saying there has to be a more effective way to create education. Like I create something and then I need to go back and revise it, or it doesn't all hang together well. Like, what's the deal? And also I was really interested in how we can make really good online programs, because of course that's where so much is headed right now. And I thought, I don't want to half-ass it. I love learning. So I was like, no, I'll just go and get my master's in this, which is silly, but I did. And then once I did that, I thought, okay, I want to take what I've got out there in the world. And even though I love my job, and I still work with Y Yoga, I'm a teacher trainer for them. I'm a teacher for them. I love these guys. They're great. But I wanted to extend what I knew beyond, because basically we've created all the teacher trainings now and they're good to go. So I want to be able to help other people do that really well and leverage education to expand their yoga business in a way that is really high quality. Because as we know, not all trainings are created equal. And, I want to help people shine and do their best.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. I've been to, I think, like 1 or 2 Y Yoga classes. I used to work for Lululemon, and I went to a training in Vancouver when I was living in Alberta full time, and went to like a Y Yoga class. So that's cool. I'm like, I don't remember who the teacher was. Like maybe I went to your class.
You might have. We can pretend it was me. It was
yeah. Slim chances. I know it's a big company, but still. That's really awesome though. And one thing that I really, really like when I was looking at your website when we were first connecting is that under your teacher section, you have stop surviving and start thriving, which is pretty much the tagline that I didn't identify of how I feel about how teachers should be in the yoga space is we kind of get into the industry, we do those free classes like you were talking about, and then there becomes a point where we're like, okay, I can't keep doing this if I don't start making money. But then it's kind of this complicated thing. I'm curious, can we dive into a little bit about sort of the concept of stop surviving, start thriving, your philosophies around sort of money, teachers making money, and how we can start making more money as yoga teachers?
Yes, we can. We can totally dive into that. So, I've been there, the hustle, right? It's like teachers, what we do, and we're so grateful to be doing something we love, at least at first, that we don't quite realize that we're on this crazy treadmill. Because as long as teachers are only teaching public yoga classes, we are usually required to run around the city. If you're a full-time yoga teacher, you probably have to teach 4 classes a day just to survive, especially if your city is expensive. And it really depends how much you earn. We don't earn a lot unless you have a lot of seniority. So in order to make that transition from basically being paid per hour and just kind of struggling through to, having some financial security, being able to take a breath, You have to start incorporating other offerings into what you do. And that can either be something like retreats, teacher trainings, online courses, but something that you don't have to actually be physically present in the room in order to make money. Or, those physically present in the room things like teacher trainings or corporates or yoga privates, at least you're making a higher price point. So as long as students or as long as teachers are kind of just running from public class to public class and scrambling around, it's like that's where we get so much teacher burnout, And I feel like there are some people in the world who are totally suited to teaching 25, 30 classes a week and being like, I'm thrilled, I'm so happy, this totally suits my energy. These are like the working, I'm trying to think of a really highly energetic animal, like a dog. It's just like the workhorse. It's like, this is what they can do and it suits their temperament. But for many of us, we have to find a different way to find that kind of balance so that we actually still love yoga and can do our own practice. How about that? So many teachers I know teach all the time and then don't practice. And it's like, wow, then what are we doing it for if we can't take care of ourselves, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of like the biggest challenges with that is that, it's like most of us come to it because we love the practice. And then for me, for sure, I know like 25 classes a week is way too many classes for me to have any interest on spending any additional time on a yoga mat or in a yoga studio. And obviously that's different for everyone. I know I worked with a yoga teacher in Atlanta who just could run circles around me energetically. I feel like when you say like some people can do it, I think immediately of her. So I feel like there's definitely no right or wrong with that. But yeah, for most of us, that's quite a bit. And even with that, like if you're teaching 25 public classes, even if you're making $50 a class, it's not like it's not like a bad income, but it's not like a thriving income per se.
No, that's like, yeah.
It feels like there's a ceiling with it, right? Like because you're dependent on the number of classes. So I love sort of like adding that other stuff in terms of taking your business online. Like what are some ways that yoga teachers can start building like online clients?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we have to be reasonable. I see so many emails out there. I built a 6-figure course and it just makes me I just throw up in my mouth from that. Like I hate that. This idea of education as sales. It's just, like, yes, I want yoga teachers to share their vision, share their brand, share their unique voice, and share what they can teach with the world. But I think that we have to be realistic that nothing anymore out there is really a get rich quick, scheme. It's not. It's going to be a like sensible building a strong foundation over time. So some ways that I see yoga teachers being able to go online is like through short courses. Like so many students come to me and they're like, oh my gosh, I have to travel, but I wish you could come with me, So there's a lot of, there's so many vendors out there for online classes, but what we have is thinking about how we can connect to our local community, but make it easier for them to access us. So it's not like we have to be the next, I don't know, whatever, Gaiam video series. But if you want to create like some yoga at home online classes for your students who love you and know you and your community, that will start the immediate community going, and then that will expand out over time. Creating like short tutorials or creating like a mentorship course. I mean, my lever, of course, is education. So that's where I go and I say like, okay, so how can you share what you do in a way that allows you to have some evergreen income that works for you when you're asleep? And it might not be gangbusters, but it'll be a slow trickle that can build over time and support you. So you're not running around like crazy person, right? So usually I go to like a short continuing education course or like a yoga at home practice, or, the wonderful thing about yoga is that people have so many different passions. Like this person's excited about the chakras. This person's excited about Ayurveda. So it's like what I like to draw out of people. What is your unique voice? What is your unique passion? And from that niche, right, it's like figuring out, okay, who is your ideal student and what is your particular voice in this space? And let's really get clear about that and really specific about that. Don't try to be everything to everybody, but get really clear about that and then start to create some small offerings that identify you as an expert in that space. And then that'll help then everything kind of builds on each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I really love that. And I'm glad that you started that with like, there is so much like learn how to do what I'm doing by paying me more money, and I'll teach you how to make money online. Especially like because I travel as well, and I'm kind of in the travel space. I see a lot of like, learn how I became a digital nomad by paying me a bunch of money. I see through that business model.
Well, and there's so many, and what I've had to learn too, I mean, because I've only been an entrepreneur in this space for about a year. Mm-hmm. So it's been an interesting learning curve for me to try to figure that, to learn more about this. But it's like so many of those people that say, I earned $300,000 in my first course. And it's like, yeah, that's because you spent $275,000 in marketing. Like, so it's not always an authentic representation of what success actually looks like. So, I don't know. It's like a little tricksy out there with all that nonsense. And I'm more a fan of like slow, steady, and good quality stuff. Like, let's make really good quality stuff, because you could make a course, just make one, and no one will come back because it's not good. So let's make something that's really good and take some care with that. And then you can build from there in a way that, has integrity, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And in terms of kind of like the marketing side of this stuff, I feel like that's like one of the things that, in my experience, yoga teachers struggle with the most, because it feels kind of like disingenuous to be marketing these spiritual practices. Yeah. How can we start marketing ourselves, like both online and in person, in a way that like sort of feels a little bit more authentic?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've struggled with that too, for sure. I think one of the things that we can keep in mind, and this is actually, I think, marketing 101, is to keep in mind that you're not selling like you're selling an experience that someone is going to have. And for us to remember, I plunked down my visa and spent $3,000 on my first yoga teacher training because it was something that was meaningful to me. And for us to remember how much we've invested in our education and in our self-care and in our yoga growth. Like, you look at any yoga teacher, how much money have they spent on their teacher trainings and continuing educations and props and workshops? So I think when we start to go, oh, right, I've spent a lot of money on this, there is value there, and let me think about the experience that I'm actually trying to offer to this human. And when we keep that experience in mind, then I think we're in a better position to actually price it reasonably, rather than thinking about like, oh, it's me, or why am I worth that? Or, this is supposed to be spiritual. It's like, no, everyone has to eat, and you've spent lots of money on things. So there needs to be, it's part of the whole flow, right? And we should be able to ask for a fair exchange for services and for a value that we're providing. I mean, I know it's a hard switch for us, but I think the more we can keep what they're getting out of it in mind, the better we'll sort of feel about the authenticity of what we're offering. And that's why we can stand behind, like, when we create something, is like, no, I know I put work into this. I know I put care in this. So I feel good about charging this amount. So that's part of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. I love all of that and totally agree as well. I think that like knowing your value and your worth can be one of the hardest, like, sort of internal practices that we need to do, because I was actually just talking with a client about this, like this idea of like, okay, like I want to make more money, which means I need to do more offerings or price myself higher. And then it's this immediate like voice inside your head that's like, but will anybody pay for that? Like, am I worth that? Which is really, really right. tough to kind of deal with. But yeah, I think it's an important practice to remember that, we are creating value and understanding what that value that you are giving is.
Yes. Yeah. And when we're not sure, it's also taking away the ego of it, like taking away, because we have so much stuff about ourselves, right? Like, am I worth it? I'm not worth it, all of these things. And the more that we can keep in mind, like, what it is that we're providing, rather than making it about our own self-worth, I think we can get a little bit more clear. Just like people who think that they're amazing and might have like a little distortion about that, maybe want to charge too much, so it's like, what are we actually doing? Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. Yeah. I think too, we know as consumers, like, when you like see something and you're like, I just feel like that's like really overpriced for what I would get out of it. Yeah. I think it's like, we can kind of understand that for our own offerings. Like, if you put something out there that you're like, I would never pay for this, then that may be a sign that you're like charging too much for it. But it's finding that balance between like knowing the value of your time and knowing like the value of the product that you're offering as well, or the service. which is
Yes.
definitely easier said than done, but something that we certainly need to like delve into a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. And it's good if you're uncomfortable, it's good to take a look at that, like where is that coming from, that belief about what money is and, how that relates to spirituality. It's good. It's like asking the questions is a good start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think understanding where that discomfort comes from, like if it's a price point, is it discomfort because you actually honestly don't think it's worth that much? Or is it discomfort because like, your whole life, your parents told you that like they don't pay for things?
Right. Yeah. So we all need therapy, but then
yeah. Number one thing coming out of this episode, we all need therapy. Amazing. So I know you do a lot of work with yoga studios as well and with like systems and that type of thing. I'm curious, if there's studio owners out there listening, like what are some sort of top tips for studio owners in terms of like running a successful, thriving studio, both in terms of like having good community, good teachers, good classes, as well as making money off of it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as everybody knows, the way to make money is 1, to increase your revenue, and 2, to decrease your expenses. So as a studio owner, we need to look at kind of like, where am I spending money, and to get really brutal about what's actually necessary for the classroom experience. Like I've seen, different studios, sometimes it's kind of like, oh, but I really, really want to have the kombucha fountain. But you're like, okay, how much, what is the actual return? And sometimes there are going to be emotional choices that we make. Like I really want to offer this in my studio and I know it's expensive, but it's worth it because of the environment I'm wanting to create. But sometimes studio owners, we get into yoga oftentimes because we're shooting from the heart. It's like, I love this and I want to create something for my community, but we have to get really pragmatic and look at our bottom line and just be clear about the choices that we're making. So, do you really need to have, I don't know, whatever? Do you need to charge whatever for mat and towel service? Or do you really need to have that food and beverage thing, which doesn't earn you a lot of money? Or do you really need to have retail that's not on consignment, right? So just being clear about where you're spending money, of course. And I know it sounds so simple, but sometimes it's actually very hard to do, and we have some blind spots. So that would be one thing. And then number 2, of course, it's like keeping your teachers happy and creating a community where you all can support each other. So what I think a healthy yoga community looks like, it's like teachers are on the front line. And the more that you can support the teachers to thrive in their own personal business, and the more that can be reciprocated to support you, the better. So I'm thinking about things like mutually advantageous social media. So if like teachers are doing workshops, that everybody's on board with how the promotion of it is going to look. Like sometimes it's easy for teachers to get into the habit of saying, oh, I'm running a workshop at your studio and it's your job to promote it. But rather we need to create like a real team effort where it's clear that, hey, I want to support you in your business. And the more you are able to support the studio too and help us thrive, the more we're able to turn around and then do things like, I can give you a better incentive for your class, or, I can give you more workshops and, help you to earn more money too. So I feel like the more we can treat teachers as a win-win kind of relationship, the better. It's easy for studios sometimes, and maybe this is just because I'm coming from a couple different corporate situations, but sometimes teachers, it's kind of like just seen as like the expense. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, here's how much I have to pay my teachers, rather than seeing teachers and remembering, which I think is what happens. This is what happens in a healthy studio situation, remembering that teachers are really the front line and they're the face of your studio. So we really have to create kind of a team, and from the very beginning when we bring teachers on, is to create like a team player kind of attitude where we're all working together towards the same goals.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I think that it is really important for teachers to feel like they are a part of the studio. Like it's not just like the studio owner's studio and they're like filling the time slots that person doesn't want. Like, why would you want to promote your classes or something like that, right? Like the teacher needs to feel like they're really a part of that. And I think that naturally comes then that they want to share a little bit more. And also I think sometimes too, studio owners aren't clear about the expectations. It's important to remember that most yoga teachers aren't trained in marketing. It's just not really something that we're taught in teacher training. It's we are taught how to be great in the studio space. We're not taught about like how to get our Instagram going. Like we have to learn that on our own. So it's like if you expect something of them with a workshop, I think it's really important to like clearly explain those expectations right from the get-go.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And studio owners, I mean, my heart goes out to y'all because oftentimes you're run off your feet trying to teach a bunch of classes, managing a whole thing. So you don't necessarily think, oh, I have to sit down and have a talk about this explicitly. But your teachers will actually appreciate the coaching and the clarity. So I think that's a great point.
Hey everyone, we're taking a quick break from the podcast to talk about how to get more students to your yoga studio. Hey yoga studio owners, I'm guessing you probably opened your studio because you love yoga and want to help others live longer, healthier lives. And you probably want to make a living at it, right? But if you're like many of the other studio owners I know, reality has started to creep in. You're discovering you have to wear all the hats to keep costs down. You're the owner, you're the teacher, you're the accountant, you're the marketer, and you're the salesperson. And instead of making a healthy profit, you're living paycheck to paycheck, working long hours just to keep the lights on. Your personal practice has fallen off because there's just not enough time in the day and you're exhausted. You've tried every kind of marketing under the sun, but nothing brings new clients through the door. And you didn't start this business to twiddle your thumbs. Well, I want to tell you there's a better way. I want to show you how to stop working so hard, bouncing from one thing to the next and trying a bunch of stuff that you've seen on the internet that just doesn't seem to be working. If I gave you our complete system that will help you get a minimum of 10 to 20 new students every single month, would that be worth a little bit of your time? Here it is. Ron Medlin and his team at GetYogaStudents.com has developed a 3-step system that will help you quickly grow your yoga studio to 6-figure profits and beyond without being shackled to your business. So if you're ready to grow fast and you'd like the blueprint to help you get started, visit GetYogaStudents.com today to get the exact system Ron and his team uses to help his yoga studio clients add 10, 20, or even 30 new students every single month. Head on over to GetYogaStudents.com and book your free consultation today. All right, back to the podcast episode. Are there any other things, I guess, from like a systems standpoint that you've really like helped yoga studio owners with that a lot of yoga studio owners aren't necessarily doing?
Well, I think that primarily in my work, it's been about how do we manage teachers effectively. And you know what? This is a big piece. Which is, and it comes back to clarity and expectations, but in kind of a bigger way, which is when a teacher comes on, right now, when teachers come into a new yoga studio to work, it's usually kind of like, great, this is the rate that I'll give you, and maybe you'll get a raise someday and maybe you won't, right? It's like, it's just kind of like, because again, studio owners don't necessarily think about putting some really explicit processes in place for what does it take to get a raise, for example. What kind of behaviors do I want to see from my teachers that's actually going to tell me that you are doing what I think is a good job? So let's get super clear about that. Let's get super clear about what I want you to do, like how many times I want you to, Instagram about your upcoming workshop or your classes. How do I want you to talk to the students before and after class? And it's taking some of those things that seem rather kind of organic and not explicit, like, oh, hey, this is just a good teacher because they connect with their students. Well, what does connect with their students mean? And can you make that measurable and give the teachers a guide so that they know what they need to do to be successful and to grow their classes? And can you tell them out of the starting gate, hey, this is what we can do to reward you in a year if your classes show this kind of success. And if you can't figure out how to get there, let's talk about it and I can help give you tips or guide you to get you to that place. So I think demystifying, because God, I was just talking to a yoga teacher the other day about this, and we were talking about asking for a raise, right? And she's terrified to ask for a raise because somebody she knows asked for a raise and then got her classes cut, so it's like there's some fear out there when you're a yoga teacher and it's a competitive environment of asking for what you want because you're afraid that we're in a position of not having the power, right? Someone could take our classes away unless you're what they call a rock star yoga teacher, which is very kind of rare and like this mystical unicorn, right? It just happens to have a ton of people in their classes.
Yeah.
So I think the more we can demystify it and quite honestly make it a professional environment where you're like, oh yes, this is what you do to get a promotion with us, and making that really transparent will help your teachers feel more safe about what's expected of them and their performance. And it'll also give them a guide to know what they can expect from you. And if you're transparent with them and say like, you guys, we're so tight, right now with finances, I can't give you a raise, but let's look at what could happen in 6 months, or let's look at what could happen here, or here's another way that I can try to help you build community and we can work together. So transparency, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, it is actually kind of interesting how, like I came from a corporate background as well. And it just seems like it's pretty built in, like everywhere that I've ever worked. After 6 months or 1 year, you have like a performance review. There's usually like a raise that goes along with it if you've been performing at, doing your job the way that it was outlined to you when you got hired. And it is kind of interesting because it seems like the standard is not that way in the yoga industry. Like, I don't think I've ever worked for a studio that's like, hey, we're going to review you in like 6 months and kind of talk about how this is going. I think, studio owners have come to classes, given feedback, had conversations, but there's never been anything that's kind of like officially built into like the teaching contract.
Yeah. Well, part of that is a problem between having contractors versus having employees.
Yeah.
So, when you have a contractor, you're really not supposed to be giving them feedback. And when you have an employee, then you can have a game plan. So most studios run their teachers as contractors, right? So that leads to, so sometimes the studio's hands are tied too in terms of certain kinds of support that they can give, or certain kinds of feedback that they can give. So it is a bit of a tricky situation in that way.
Yeah, definitely. Is there like a kind of legal workaround with that? I feel like workaround's not the right word. I'm not trying to find like a hack in the system Loophole. Or whatever. Yeah. But like, is there kind of a way that yoga studios can kind of incorporate that? Like, hey, this is like the process for getting a raise, or is it just as simple as that? Like, this is what we do at the studio if you like for having conversations around getting raises.
I think you can include expectations, like performance expectations. So if teachers are clear about performance expectations, then those are things that you guys can talk about. Because, contractors, I think they technically set their own rate, which is rarely what happens. Usually it's the studio that sets the rate and says, here's the contract, do you want to take it? But they can negotiate their rate from that point. And if the studio is able to include, say, like performance expectations, this is what we, expect you to do as for being in this role and part of this, organization. I think you can do it that way. Now, in terms of more formal review processes, like going to classes and giving feedback and creating a game plan for success, you can't really do that in a formal way. But I think there's plenty of ways to do that, informally, or to offer, ways to support people with their businesses. Like I'm a huge fan of giving teachers, the ability to go to workshops at discounted rates and things like that. And I think that that's one of the challenges is that there is some blurriness there. But it's absolutely appropriate. Like if you had a plumber to say, yes, I expect you to fix my sink and I expect it to go this way and for there not to be a flood afterwards. So you can outline those things without it being an employee relationship. Now, HR in that way is not my specialty. I'm not an HR specialist, but this is my understanding of it based on my work at a few different places.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. That makes sense. So something that, when I was looking at your, I don't know if it's like your resume or your bio or your website and that sort of thing, is that you have like 3,500 hours of curriculum design, which is absolutely incredible. That's amazing. Yeah. That makes you pretty much an expert in that. So I'm curious if we can dive in a little bit about that, because I think it's one of those things that, people become like ERYT 500 certified. They feel like maybe they're at the point where they want to offer a teacher training, that they want to teach other teachers. But I think the biggest thing is like, where do you start? And I know Yoga Alliance provides like, if you want to do a Yoga Alliance teacher training, I think it provides like a rough outline of what you need to include. But I think there's a lot of like, where do I even start to begin this?
Yes.
So I'm curious, where do you start?
You start with my Start Here course. It's so funny. I actually created a whole like suite of online little modules just specifically designed to help bridge that gap between I'm a yoga teacher, I want to make the leap to education. How do I do that? So actually, this is free, and so your people who are out there listening or thinking about it might want to check it out. It's a course which says basically like, should I create a teacher training? Is that actually part of my mission? Because not everybody, even though teacher trainings have become so common, not everybody needs to offer a teacher training. There might be other ways that you want to service your yoga community and build your brand that don't involve education, because education is actually quite specific, and you need a different set of skills to run a teacher training than you do to run a public class, a workshop, I'd say a retreat. There's some crossover, but when you're running a teacher training, you have to be interested in structure. And if you're not interested in structure, your teacher training will not go well, because you cannot fluff it for 200 hours. You can fluff it for by fluff it, I mean be organic and intuitive and kind of go with the flow. I don't mean make things up, but you can't be organic and go with the flow for 180 contact hours. You just can't. Your students won't learn. And your training might be a fun experience, but it won't be educationally useful. So one of the things to think about is this am I interested in that? Am I interested in sitting down and organizing time and space and sticking to a schedule and being really kind of using the left side of my brain and being really logical in this way about the learning outcomes for the student? And if you're like, yes, I love teacher training. If you're the kind of person who like loves getting a handout, and you're the kind of person who, loves to take notes and loves to organize things and, put them into binders and make everything, make everything fit into an index, then yes, this is a good leap for you to make. And if you're a more organic thinker, that's totally fine. It just means that you're going to need a little support to bridge the gap to those skills. Totally fine, but you just need to be thoughtful about how you want to organize things. So I'll share with you the biggest mistake that I see people make when they create any kind of education. And I made this mistake. It's why I had to revise the first 200-hour I made. I had to revise it for 3-4 years before it got to a place where it was actually in truly in service of the students. It's why I went back and got my master's and said, how can I do this better? So the great mistake, which is totally normal for us to make as yoga teachers, is that we think our training is about what we tell our students. We think that the training is about what we download to them or what we talk about or what we lecture. And we think it's about like basically what I tell you. And that's not what the training is about. Real education is about what the students can do. It doesn't really matter what you say. What matters at the end of the day is what kind of skills or things can the students demonstrate to indicate their mastery over the subject. And this is, it seems like a simple thing, but it's actually quite a turnaround, because as a yoga teacher, I go into a public class and it's all about what I say. It's all about, I'm directing a show in a weird way, and I'm downloading my information to you. But in a teacher training, I have to flip that around and think, here's where my students are starting. Here's where I want them to get to. What do they need to do to get them there? And so it becomes less about us imparting all of our wisdom. If we actually told our students everything we knew, we just overwhelm them. They'd run out of the door screaming. It's like too much information. So instead, we have to create like small little chunks of time to help them learn particular skills to demonstrate and do certain things. So that's like the biggest reframe that you can start to think about. And by doing that, it's going to change how you do workshops too, which is great. And it's like, what do I want my students to be able to do at the end of this time with them, and to focus on how you get there. So interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much good stuff in there. And then once people are actually kind of diving into building these courses or building out these trainings, how do you actually start, selling and filling them out? Because I think that that's like, you make this big hurdle of actually creating it. How do you actually get people to come?
How do you market it? Yeah. How do you get bums in seats? For sure. Well, I think that sometimes we think we have to expand, like the idea that we have to be global. I think it's actually about being really focused with our marketing and being really grassroots and starting local. Like, who do you know? How can you get the word out in your immediate community? And of course, there's going to be social media thing. And honestly, with marketing, it's like you have to hit people over the head so many times before they know that you're up to anything, because there's so much noise out there, right? So it's not being afraid of being repetitious as well. But like Instagram is huge with yogis. Facebook is always huge. Doing the promotional ads in there in a smart way is good. But I think you also got to think like, where do my students hang out? If you're a yoga teacher, it's great. You usually see them in class every week. So being relentless about, hey, here's another announcement, or hey, I just made these little business cards I'm leaving in the corner of class. You can grab one if this interests you. It's really about your people and the people that they know, like the first couple circles, rather than just blasting it out to the universe in the hopes that everything's going to go well. I'm a fan of like pulling on your own network and really starting to acknowledge how many people you are connected to. So it's kind of like friends of friends, getting other teachers and doing mutual promotions that way, like building a community where instead of feeling in competition with all these other teachers, we actually feel like, hey guys, let's all support each other and we can actually move farther faster. So, social media is huge, yes, but I say like in-person contacts are actually bigger, and probably those are more viable leads for this kind of thing than someone you would just find randomly online.
Yeah. I think it is like just thinking about like the sort of thought process that you went into picking a teacher training. Like I know when I first did my 200 hour, it was like, it took me like a long time to decide on a company that I wanted to go with. Like it was like a couple of months of sort of researching, finding one that interested me, coming back to it. Like the amount of times I like closed the tab, Googled more places, opened the tab again. Like even the same thing for my 300 hour, like it's a big investment for people. And I think it's important to remember that they're putting like a lot of trust in you and they're expecting a lot out of it. I think like as the teacher leading it, it's really important to remember that side of things.
Absolutely. Yes. It's one of the biggest investments around, which is why so many people are running teacher trainings as a way to earn money. But if we don't put the students first and think about what's their experience and get really clear about our values, then the training won't be as successful. So yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I want to support people to create great education. And honestly, not everybody is motivated to, because if you're offering a teacher training and you're getting students, sometimes people think, well, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But I'm kind of like, no, fix it. There are ways that for many of the trainings out there are ways that it could be even more better, like it could be even greater. And then you could have, your students could feel like more confident in their own teaching skills when they graduate. And I think for me, I mean, I'm a nerd. I know it's like, I probably err on the side of, wanting things to be of a high caliber in a way that's not always perhaps financially the best. Like you shouldn't like maybe linger so long over this offering, but I want things to be really, really good. And so I think that it's worth it to really keep like just the simple act of serving your students. If you keep that in mind, then that'll take you far.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that definitely, I mean, as a yoga teacher, as like anyone who's in the yoga space, I think serving's like definitely the place to come from. You mentioned that there's kind of like some, I guess, like skills or traits that are sort of necessary for running teacher trainings. And I would absolutely agree with you, because you really can't be making it up on the spot. So I think there is some sort of like organizational aspect. How do you kind of know if running teacher trainings is right for you or not? Like obviously there's this sort of element of like trying things out or diving into something, but it is also like a big time investment on the side of the teacher trainer. And it's also like you're putting like a big thing out there as for like trainees. Like if you don't do a good job, like that's kind of, a big sort of like hit to your social credibility. So how do you kind of like figure out beforehand if it's going to be right for you?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is, are you willing to do the work? So when you design curriculum, usually the ratio is anywhere from 4 hours of work to 1 hour of curriculum. Depending on if you're doing like online stuff, it could be like 8 hours of work, 10 hours of work, depending on it, to 1 hour of curriculum. So if you're looking at a 200-hour course, let's just keep in mind that that's going to take you at least, should probably take you 800 hours to create. I mean, maybe it won't take you that long because some of the things are going to be easiest, sort of lather, rinse, repeat. You'll be able to get a flow. So not all of that. You can duplicate some of your work, but it's like, are you willing to sit down and actually put in the effort to make something that's good? And if the answer is no, that's totally fine. But it's just like, yes, does that appeal to you? The other thing to keep in mind, okay, so organization is one thing, but are you willing to hold space emotionally for students? Because when you are a teacher trainer, it's slightly different than being teaching public classes, because you're having to hold space in a really adult way for a lot of emotional experiences. And so you need to shelve your ego and actually be there to support the students. You're going to have the students who trigger you. You're going to have the student who always asks the crazy offside question. You're going to have the students who kind of like aren't showing up there fully. You're going to have the students that you don't understand. You're going to have the students who are having we laugh. We're like, every teacher training has tears. Like, teacher training is a really emotional experience. And a lot of times your students are coming to that experience in transition in their lives, in their relationships, in their jobs. And they're really diving into their own process, their own practice, and their own self-connection. So you have to be ready and have the emotional maturity to hold a safe container for all of that, and to be supportive and not get in the way. And so I think that requires someone who's interested in really taking on that kind of work and being very thoughtful and compassionate and reflective.
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely makes sense. Thank you for fielding that question. I know that was a bit of like an ambiguous question to throw out there.
No, it actually makes total sense. I've thought about that. So
yeah, I think it's just, we look at like, okay, if you don't want to teach like 25 classes a week and you want to make like maybe more money or be expanding your offerings, I think it's like something that a lot of people consider. And I remember being in my 200-hour teacher training and so many people were like, well, maybe I'll open a yoga studio. And that was one of the things that kind of got me thinking about like the business side of yoga. Like I was like, I think we can make money in this industry not opening yoga studios, because I had been working as a studio manager for like 6 months at that point. And I was like, this is definitely like not for everyone.
Yeah.
Like you absolutely have to have that organizational side of things to run a successful studio, which not everyone has, which is totally fine.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Amazing. So I'm curious, what are some of your, I guess, biggest business lessons, not only from your own career, but just from things that you've sort of learned working with studios, with students, running trainings, helping facilitate trainings, running retreats, all that good stuff?
That's a huge question.
How much more time do you have?
Let me just try to hit a few points. I mean, one thing I think is be authentic. Be authentic to your own teaching voice, your own teaching style, and your own teaching goals. And, if you're a yoga teacher out there, you don't need to fit into any particular box. Like, have integrity in who you are, and remember, and this is more for the yoga teachers, you're not going to appeal to everybody, and that's okay. Like, in order for you to find your students and your tribe, some people are not going to resonate with that. Don't try to be everyone's teacher. Be the teacher for your students. Like, for me, I'm a freaking alignment nerd, and I'm also ridiculous and silly in class. So, like, if you want a very contemplative, quiet experience, that's likely not going to be in my class. We're going to be more rambunctious, and we're going to talk about alignment a lot. And, so there's always, everyone's going to have their different style, and to really honor your own voice in that space. And that goes for studios as well. It's like, sometimes we think that, I think the way to earn money and be successful is to appeal to everybody. And I actually feel like we get more traction when we hone in and stay committed to the vision. So that would be one thing that I would offer out there. I think being transparent in business, and by that I mean the yoga world. And I was talking to some of my friends who are in the business recently, and they're like, because I wrote an article about how studios can keep their teachers happy. And they're like, but our teachers drive us crazy. It's like, be a professional.
Yeah.
It's like teachers are like, it's a full moon, I can't teach my class. We're like, what is happening? So it's, if you want to be a professional in the business space, then treat yourself as your own business. You are the sole proprietor of your business. Treat it as such. If you want to be a business person, and if you want to like have the respect of your studio managers, then arrive in the space as you would if you were going to work at a bank or, whatever. So we sometimes can treat the yoga space casually, and it draws sometimes more intuitive, creative, less structured personalities, which is fine. We love you for that. But it's like, also take yourself seriously and take your work seriously. And I think that sometimes the more you do that, the more you'll actually feel like you're worthy of the paycheck that you're bringing in too. It's like, if I show up for my class every week and I am committed to helping my students, then I'm going to feel really good about asking for my pay rate, right? If I'm like, oh, it's like I don't feel good, or, oh, I want to go to this music festival and I got to bail, then that I'm actually kind of undermining my own sense of worthiness in what I'm doing. So I think being a professional, and that goes for our yoga studio managers too. When I say be professional, it's like what we were talking about before with transparency. It's like treat your yoga teachers as professionals and as business owners, and oftentimes they will rise to that relationship too. If you're saying like, yeah, these are our performance expectations, this is what we expect, and if you don't rise to that, well then that's okay, but this isn't the right fit. It's like to be candid and to have those open conversations, and I think that actually serves everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I really love those. And I'm a big fan of professionalism as well. I think just like naturally coming from like a business degree, corporate background, it's like some of the things I've seen come through like the studio management inbox is like so shocking to me. I'm just like, this is not how, like, this isn't how you get a job. Like, it's just not. Emails with typos, like it just feels like such basic knowledge that we should have that unfortunately not everyone does have, which is fine. It's an opportunity to teach and to learn then. But yeah, even as something as simple, it makes me think about, I was just in Mexico with my boyfriend, and we took like a little week vacation over my birthday, and we were in this really beautiful beach town in the state of Oaxaca. And I saw this flyer for this woman offering like private stand-up paddleboard course or classes. It's like an hour. It's like really good price. And so I sent her an email, which was like on the flyer, and she just never responded to me. Like to this day, like I just haven't been responded to. And my thought was like, if she did respond at some point, I wanted to write back and be like, dude, like answer your emails. Like we were ready to give her 600 pesos for an hour. Like that's not bad money in Mexico.
Wow. Right.
So yeah, it's something as simple as like, responding to your emails in a timely fashion. Or if you're somebody who knows that you don't do that, have like an email autoresponder.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for touching on that, because that's the one that definitely like grinds my gears for sure.
I get it. I totally understand.
Amazing. So if people want to learn more about you, maybe take a class with you, work with you in any capacity, where can they go to find more about you?
Sure. Well, my website, you can go to rachelyoga.com, RACHELYOGA. And I've got tons of stuff on there. I have what I call the big blog too, which is on there, which is just, it's tons of resources. If you're a student, if you are a teacher, educator, I love sharing what I know. So I put a lot of stuff out there that you might find helpful. Another place that you can find me is on YouTube, and that's Rachel Scott Yoga. And I have a channel there. I have all my, as I said, I wrote a book about dating and yoga and relationships. I've actually written 2 books. And so you'll find a whole bunch of heart-centered stuff on there, but also tips for students for practice and tips for teachers. So specifically targeting, because I love teacher training, specifically helping newer yoga teachers to really be clear about their own skill set and to improve certain things like cueing and sequencing and that kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of resources on there. And then if you want to just practice with me and get a whiff of my alignments and all that stuff, you can go to doyogawithme.com, which is a wonderful online space for free yoga classes. And they've got tons of great teachers, and I teach online classes there for free. And it's just awesome. There's so many resources there and tons of good stuff. So lots of ways to get in touch with me. And I'm always happy to have a conversation with somebody. From my website, you can just sign up and get a little chat with me, and we can do virtual coffee together. And if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a yoga studio or a teacher who's struggling with the next aspect of what you're working on, particularly in the educational space, I'm always happy to lend an ear. And because I always figure like, great, if we work together, awesome. But if not, maybe down the line we will, or at least it's been a great conversation and someone new to meet. So totally happy to chat.
Amazing. I love that. And yeah, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for fielding all of my weird, random, challenging questions. I always appreciate that. And
Amanda, these are great questions. No, what a pleasure. No, super smart questions. Really good.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Amanda.
All right. I hope that you enjoyed that episode of the podcast with Rachel Scott. Make sure you go check her out. And once again, if you're in the Vancouver area or going to be in the Vancouver area, definitely take some time and go to one of her classes at Y Yoga. As always, you can find notes on the website at www.mbomyoga.com. You can find me on social media at Mastering the Business of Yoga on Facebook and Instagram. You can join the private community at Yoga Business Badasses. And Meghan and I still have a few spots left in our Costa Rica retreat for yoga teachers that's coming up in November. It's November 2nd to 9th, 2019 in Nusara, Costa Rica. It's going to be a really, really fun adventure. It's basically just a week of relaxation, rejuvenation with some yoga, some meditation, some really good food, and a couple of business workshops thrown in there. So if you'd like to learn more about that, you can head on over to www.mbomyoga.com/retreats, or to go straight to the registration page, which has a little bit more detail about what we're going to be doing, what's included in the prices, accommodation, etc. You can head on over to bit.ly.com/yoga teacher retreat CR. Of course, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback or anything for me, you can send me an email at info@mbomyoga.com. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Namaste.